Hey there! This video is going to be a deep dive technical comparison between the new Blackmagic 6K full frame and the Canon R5C. Before we get into it, just have to have a huge thank you to B&H Photo who lent me the 6K full frame to test review and make videos like this for all of you. So if you're looking to pick up some camera gear, I highly recommend you check out B&H Photo because that's where I buy most of my stuff from. There are links in the description for the 6K full frame, the R5C, and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So big thank you to B&H Photo who made this video possible. All right, let's dive right into it and talk about image quality. So for these comparison tests, I used my Sigma Art EF 28mm f1.4 lens, and I used the appropriate EF to RF adapter and the Sigma MC21. Now I decided to shoot everything on the R5C in RAW to be comparable with the B-RAW that's in the 6K full frame. If you're curious about the RAW and the R5C versus the internal XF AVC compressed codec, I made a video about that a little while ago and I'll leave that video linked down below. Now in the Blackmagic, I shot everything in B-RAW 5:1 in 6K DCI at the base ISO of 400 in the film setting. The reason why I chose 5:1 is that it's 194 megabytes per second or 1552 megabits per second. Now the R5C in its maximum mode is the 8K RAW ST, and I shot that at the base ISO of 800. And of course that's interpreted as C-Log2 in the editing software, but the R5C does not shoot C-Log2, but I did shoot it in RAW to get the most image quality, and that's 1580 megabits per second. So the bitrate is very similar between the two cameras. So taking a look at the footage here, I graded both of these by hand and just adjusted contrast and saturation to match as best as possible, but I didn't touch the colors at all. Both are set at the sunny white balance setting, and if you don't know, in the Blackmagic, it has a +10 magenta shift built in, but again, just the default sunny settings when I was shooting outside. Now, one big difference here is the resolution. Of course, the 6K full frame shoots in 6K, the R5C in RAW shoots in 8.2K, but I can't really see much of a difference on real life images when you're, of course, putting it in a 4K timeline. Now, you definitely see some differences in colors here, but I think it's just really personal preference. A lot of times it is with colors. And the dynamic range looks pretty similar right off the bat here. And overall, I'd say the images do look fairly similar in just their overall appearance. Of course, differences in colors. And so you can see here on the leaves, a little bit more blue on the R5C than there is on the Blackmagic 6K full frame. Also in this shot here with me in the shade, you can definitely see the difference in colors, like in my shirt. But overall, look fairly similar, lots of good detail and resolution. After looking at those outdoor examples, let's do some pixel peeping here to see if we can see some more differences between these two cameras. Remember, both of these cameras are recording in RAW and there isn't any noise reduction applied in camera. And of course I didn't apply any in post, so you see exactly what the image looks like. Now these cameras both have dual base ISOs. The Blackmagic has dual bases at 400 and 3200 and the R5C at 800 and 3200. So I want to take a look and compare these cameras at their base ISOs first. So the first example is ISO 400 on the Blackmagic and 800 on the R5C. Those are the base ISOs. The R5C is ever so slightly sharper, and I don't know if that's coming through on YouTube, but that's of course the 8K versus the 6K. And the R5C is slightly less noisy, even though it's at a higher ISO. And then comparing them at their second base ISO of 3200, the R5C again is ever so slightly sharper here. Again, it's the 8K versus 6K, but the R5C is definitely cleaner here with less noise. Next, let's talk about the low light or high ISO performance of these two cameras. Like I said, they both have dual base ISOs, the Blackmagic being 400 and 3200 and the R5C being 800 and 3200. But if you're not familiar with the Blackmagic system, even though it has a second base at 3200, the second gain stage actually kicks in at ISO 1250. And you can see this on the image when you go from 1000 to 1250 on the 6K full frame, it cleans up. And when you look at 2500 to 3200, you'll see that the R5C cleans up, but the 6K full frame doesn't. But at 400 and 3200 on the Blackmagic, that'll give you the best dynamic range in terms of the balance of highlights and shadows, and 800 and 3200 on the R5C. So as we look up into the higher ISOs, at every single ISO, the R5C is definitely much cleaner here with less noise. Now the R5C has some decent noise performance in the mid ISO range, and I think a lot of people forget about that, but it's helped out with that second base ISO of 3200. Now I recently made videos comparing the 6K full frame and 6K G2 and FX3, and the 6K G2 had better ISO performance than the 6K full frame, even though it has a smaller size sensor. The FX3 also has better ISO performance than the 6K full frame, which you would definitely expect based on the high ISO performance of the FX3. Now, after comparing the 6K full frame with a few other cameras, it really doesn't have the best high ISO or low light performance. And this is a little bit surprising since it has a full frame sensor, but it is what it is. Next, let's talk about dynamic range. And this is a little bit tricky since they have different base ISOs. And at first glance, just looking at some of the examples that I shot outside, these two cameras have similar dynamic range, and I think both are good for most situations. But I want to pin them up against each other and put them in more stressful situations to take a look at the dynamic range. So we'll do two examples here, and the way I do these is I expose for the highlights and make sure I don't clip the highlights and then take a look in the shadows. So the outdoor example that I showed you earlier, they look very similar here, but I said earlier there's definitely a difference of colors here, but I couldn't really tell what was going on, and there was much of an advantage for either one. Now this indoor example, which I always do in a dark room next to a bright window, I think it looked pretty similar in the highlights, but the R5C is an absolute mess in the shadows compared to the 6K full frame. So there's definitely a difference here in terms of dynamic range. And one thing we could chalk this up to is having a different base ISOs. Now the R5C has a higher base ISO of 800 versus 400, so you should expect slightly better highlight performance for the R5C and slightly better shadow performance for the 6K full frame. Now in that indoor example, I saw pretty similar in the highlights and of course better performance in the shadows. And I made a video about ISO performance and shooting purposely not at the base ISO for shifting dynamic range. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I'll leave that video linked down below. So now let's verify these examples with a latitude or push-pull test. For these tests, of course, I shot them at the base ISOs of 400 and 800, and I used the technical conversion LUTs for both of the cameras. So for the underexposure test, both cameras, again, I think looked pretty similar here, and we're good about to 4 stops over with a slight color shift on the Blackmagic at 4 stops over, and they both break at 5 stops. Really not surprising at all. So maybe a very tiny advantage to the R5C in the highlights, but not very significant. And this confirms what we saw in the indoor and outdoor tests. This is even the case with the fact that the R5C has a higher base ISO, and that should help the R5C in the highlights. But again, very, very similar, but maybe a slight advantage for the R5C in the highlights. Now the underexposure test, this is where it gets interesting like usual. The noise looks pretty similar, and they're both pretty good down to 2 stops under, with the R5C starting to look a little bit worse at 2 stops. Now the 6K full frame is decent and holds color well at 3 stops under. 4 and 5 stops, they both get pretty messy, but the R5C is clearly worse in the shadows. Overall, the 6K has more dynamic range than the R5C at their lower base ISOs. In terms of rolling shutter, the R5C clearly has an advantage here over the 6K full frame. Now this test was done in the 6K DCI, and if you shoot the 6K full frame in the open gate, it has even worse rolling shutter performance. So if you're concerned about rolling shutter performance, the R5C definitely performs better than the 6K full frame. The battery life is really interesting to compare on these two cameras because both of these cameras are known to have pretty poor battery life. So when I did a runtime test on the 6K full frame, I got 1 hour and 14 minutes, and that was with the included Blackmagic battery. Now the R5C has had a bunch of updates in terms of trying to get the power consumption down and make the batteries last longer. So I did a couple runtime tests. Now the R5C, when I shot in the 8K RAW ST, it ran for 60 minutes, and I had to reinitialize the card because it filled up halfway through, but I got 60 minutes running in the 8K RAW. Now, there is a power saving mode on the R5C, but you can't shoot in RAW. So what I did for that test is I shot it in the 4K XF ABC All-I with the power saving mode on. This is something I would probably do on a regular basis, and I got 1 hour and 21 minutes. So as bad as the battery life is in the 6K full frame, it's even worse than the R5C. So it is what it is. I think most people are pretty aware of that. These two cameras, you're gonna need to bring a lot of batteries with you or run external power. Now, one thing that's interesting is that the 6K full frame, the battery icon turns red when it gets low, but it's really difficult to tell how much life you have left. Now on the R5C, it does have a minute countdown, so it gives you a much better idea of how close you are to the battery running out. So I find that to be helpful, at least in the R5C. In terms of stabilization and autofocus, of course, I didn't test these because the 6K full frame does not have any stabilization and does not have a continuous autofocus. The R5C does not have IBIS, but it also has digital stabilization, which is really helpful in some situations. And of course, it has autofocus. So if you need stabilization, autofocus, of course, the R5C has an advantage here. Next, let's talk about stills. Now, I don't really talk much about photography on this channel, but the fact that the R5C is an R5 inside, which is a fantastic photo camera, clear advantage here for the R5C if you need to take photos. You can take stills with the Blackmagic, but it produces a B-RAW file and you can't see a preview on the back of the camera, and the workflow is a little bit more complicated. So I think it's no question here that if you're looking for photography capabilities, the R5C is a clear advantage here. Next, we'll talk about resolutions and aspect ratios. So the 6K full frame can shoot in 6K open gate, which is a huge feature of this camera. It shoots with the full sensor or the ratio of 3:2. It also shoots in the 6x5 anamorphic mode, 6K DCI, and 2.4:1, and it has some other smaller sensor readouts. So these are all in B-RAW. So if it has less than 6K resolution, it's actually cropping it on the sensor. The R5C has a couple different options here. Now, the R5C can shoot full width 8K, either in RAW or MP4, and it can also shoot internal compressed codecs in 4K with the full width of the sensor in XFAVC and MP4. The R5C also has the ability to shoot UHD or DCI in full frame mode, where the 6K full frame doesn't have that option. Of course, you can shoot that way and crop it, but it doesn't have that in camera. So in addition to all that, the R5C can also shoot in Super 35 or Super 16 modes, both RAW and the oversampled internal compressed codec. So a bunch of differences between the two cameras depending on what you need, but a lot of people really like the fact that the 6K full frame has the open gate recording. In terms of codecs, the Blackmagic can shoot in B-RAW. The previous versions of this camera, the Pocket Cinema camera 6Ks, also shot in ProRes, but they eliminated that with the 6K full frame. Now the R5C can shoot RAW, and it comes in a couple different flavors, ST, LT, and HQ in some of the crop modes. It can also shoot with some compressed codecs, XFAVC, and MP4, either in HEVC or H.264. So it is nice to have the option to record RAW or compressed codecs in the R5C. Next, talk about higher frame rates. So starting out with the 6K full frame, you can shoot in open gate and the 6x5 anamorphic at 30 frames per second or 36 frames per second in off speed. In 6K DCI, you can shoot in 30 frames per second or 48 frames per second off speed. And in the 2.4:1 ratio, you can shoot in 60 frames per second in both. Now the R5C, when you're shooting in full frame, you can shoot up to 8K 60 RAW. You can also shoot up to 4K 120 in XFAVC and MP4. In Super 35, you can shoot up to 6K 60 RAW or 4K 60. And Super 16, you can shoot a 3K 60 RAW or 1080p 60. So a lot of options when you're talking about higher frame rates with the R5C. I think that's a huge advantage over the 6K full frame. Let's talk about picture profiles. So on the Blackmagic, you can shoot in video, which is the full Rec 709 colored in look. You can shoot in film, which is the log or sort of flat picture profile, or extended video, which is kind of in between. So you get those three different options. So in the R5C, you can shoot in RAW, of course, and when you do that, it is interpreted as C-Log2 in your editor, but this camera does not shoot in C-Log2, it's just the way the computer handles it. So if you're not shooting in RAW, you can shoot in C-Log3, and there is no C-Log2, like I said before, but you also have a few other options like YDR, PQ, HLQ. One of my favorites is Canon 709. I think it gives a really nice picture profile for things like streaming or just getting an image right out of camera. So a few more options on the R5C. Also for all of these, you can go through and you can edit these and make them whatever you want. So a lot more flexibility in terms of picture profiles in the R5C. Both of these cameras, you can put custom LUTs into them. Now, there's a little bit of difference here in the way they use them. So a lot more flexibility with the 6K full frame, because when you're using the R5C and you're shooting in XFAVC, it will actually bake the LUT into the recorded file. So if you want to use it as a display LUT but not bake it into the file, you have to shoot in RAW, in which it doesn't bake the LUT into the raw footage. So a little bit, as I said, a little more flexibility with the 6K full frame, but you can use custom LUTs in both these cameras. In terms of their HDMI outputs, the 6K full frame can only spit out 1080p, whereas the R5C can put out 4K or an 8K raw signal out of HDMI. In terms of the sensor size, they both have a 3:2 aspect ratio full frame sensor, but like I said before, you can't record open gate on the R5C. In terms of lens mounts, the Blackmagic has an L mount and the Canon has an RF mount. So there are definitely different lens options available out there if you're looking for native lenses. So depending on what you need, you might have a preference either way. Now, like I said before, you can use adapters like I was using for this. So the Canon EF to RF adapter and the Sigma MC21 to adapt these to EF. But because they're both mirrorless mounts, you can easily adapt them to EF, PL, cinema lenses, vintage lenses, pretty much whatever you want. So you have a lot of flexibility there. Now, one thing you also have to keep in mind here is when you're using the R5C and you're using Canon lenses, especially the RF lenses, you do get the in-camera lens corrections when you're shooting with the compressed codecs, but not in RAW. So you can take advantage of that still when you're using the Canon RF lenses on the RF mount of the R5C. Next, talk about body design and the ergonomics of these two cameras. Clearly, there is a huge size difference between these two cameras. Also, in terms of the build quality, in my opinion, the Canon is a little bit better made. The Blackmagic is kind of plasticky, but it's personal preference of what you like. I think having a smaller camera is a little bit more advantageous because you can use it in more situations. Of course, you can rig it up, but when you need a small camera to get on a gimbal or in a tight space or just taking up less space in your bag, you do have that option. But again, the 6K full frame has some advantages, so let's take a look. So the screens are very different on these two cameras. The Blackmagic has this huge screen, which you can tilt it just in this sort of orientation here. You can't flip it forward, but it is really big and really bright, and you can see it really easily outside. And most of the time, I feel like I didn't even need a monitor when I was using this when I was behind the camera. Now, to compare that with the R5C, which has a much smaller screen, it actually flips forward so you can see yourself and shoot at lots of different angles. It's really just a personal preference thing. And I also do like the fact that you can fold it away like this and protect the screen when you're not using it. So big difference in screens. If you're filming yourself or in weird angles, then the R5C screen is going to be helpful. Also, if you are using these cameras and you have a bunch of stuff rigged up behind them, you can get the screen out of the way and still rig up behind like a battery or something behind the camera, whereas it's a little bit more awkward on the 6K full frame. Now, neither of these cameras have built-in ND filters. That's something you have to sort out on your own. In terms of the I/O on the 6K full frame, we have a 3.5mm mic jack, headphone jack, full-size HDMI, USB-C, which we can use to record externally to an SSD. We also have two mini XLR ports that have phantom power, which is really helpful. And it has a 12-volt input, which has a specific cable, but they also give you the AC adapter when you buy the 6K full frame. So a few more options here. The fact that it has built-in XLR and full-size HDMI is absolutely huge. In terms of the R5C, it has different I/O. You have a timecode port. You have USB-C, which you use for power delivery to power the camera, so you can power it off pretty much any power delivery device, power brick, V-mount battery that's got USB-C power delivery, all that sort of stuff. You have micro HDMI, which if you're watching this, you already know about that. You have a 3.5 mic jack, headphone jack, and a flash sync port. So what this camera does not have is going to be any professional audio inputs, but you can buy the Tascam XLR unit that goes on the hot shoe, and it does work really well. I know some people have had some reliability issues with it. I've owned it in the past and didn't have any of those issues, but you can get that on the top and get professional full-size XLR inputs. So if you need that, it is an option, but it's not built into the camera. Both of these cameras have fans, which is awesome. And so neither of them will overheat. And so you don't have to worry about the camera shutting down because of that. A couple other things I want to point out here. The Blackmagic has two quarter 20s on the bottom of the camera, which is absolutely fantastic for mounting a tripod plate, because when you put a plate on here, it doesn't twist. I wish all cameras have that. The R5C just has one, especially as you're rigging up cameras or have a bunch of stuff attached to it, or just even just with a big lens or something like that on a tripod. It's really handy having two. The R5C also has an EVF, so that is really nice. If you need that, it comes in handy in a lot of situations. Now, the 6K full frame, you can buy an optional EVF, which if you take off this plate, it attaches to, which is an extra $500 accessory, but you can buy it and it is an option, but it already is built into the R5C. In terms of the menus and the usability of these two cameras, I have to give an advantage to the Blackmagic. If any of you have ever used a Blackmagic camera, you know how awesome the menus are to navigate. They're very clear and simple, and you can just select whatever you want. And as I said, it's just really easy to navigate the menus, and just working the camera in general is just very easy and approachable. In addition to that, both of these cameras have shutter angle, false color, and decent exposure tools. So they're very video focused cameras. So they're both great in that regard. In terms of memory cards, the Blackmagic has one card, which is a CF Express Type B card. Now, CF Express B is my favorite type of memory card at the moment, but it only has one slot, so that is a bummer for some people, but CF Express Type B is very reliable. Also, the Blackmagic can record over USB-C to an SSD, which is what I'm doing right now with my 6K G2, which is what I'm filming this on. So you have that ability as well. Now, the R5C also has CF Express Type B, but it has one of those, and it also has an SD card slot. So you do have the ability to dual record in some of the modes, but not all of them, depending on the bit rates. So, depending on what you're doing, you could possibly do dual recording on the R5C, but those are the differences between storage on these two cameras. Lastly, onto the pricing and my recommendations. So at the time of recording this, the Blackmagic 6K full frame is selling for $2,600. The R5C lists for $4,300, but is currently on sale for $3,800. It seems like the R5C price is fluctuating constantly, so definitely check that out. It could be less expensive or more expensive whenever you're watching this video. The Blackmagic also comes with a DaVinci Resolve Studio license, which if you're looking to pick that up, it is an extra $300, which gets thrown into the camera package. So, you know, you could save some money for that if you're looking to pick that up too. Now, after using the 6K full frame and comparing it with a few other cameras, I do own the 6K G2. I've owned the R5C for a long period of time. These two cameras, in my opinion, are designed for or intended for very different users. The Blackmagic to me is more of a pure cinema camera, and I think it's more for people that want really amazing image quality and great bang for the buck. And you also get the flexibility of the internal B-RAW. Now, the Canon R5C does have great image quality as well, but the Canon RAW codec is a lot harder to edit for your editing software and for your computer. And the B-RAW has a lot more flexibility, especially if you're using DaVinci Resolve. B-RAW is just absolutely amazing to use. Now, the R5C is a much more versatile camera because it has autofocus, it has electronic stabilization, it has a flip screen, smaller form factor. You can use it for all of the above: filmmaking, videography, content creation, of course, photography. Like I said before, it has a Canon R5 in it, which is an insanely powerful photography camera. So after testing the 6K full frame and comparing it with other cameras, it was really interesting to me to put up against the R5C and see how well it stacked up. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.